So it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce my longtime colleague, Dr. Lumey. Dr. Lumey studied medicine at the universities of Leiden and Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and then history and philosophy of science at Darwin College, Cambridge. He came to Columbia University on a Fulbright and got his MPH and PhD degrees here in our epidemiology department. He returned to the Netherlands to work at the University of Amsterdam Medical Center and the Dutch National Institute for Public Health and Environmental Protection. Then he came back to New York City and worked for a time at the American Health Foundation, which is where I was a cancer epidemiologist, and that's where we first met. We had just enough time together to collaborate on one study of lung cancer with the foundation's director, cancer prevention pioneer, Ernst Winder. But that was the height of the AIDS epidemic in the late 1980s. So Bertie left to become director of the New York City Perinatal HIV Transmission Collaborative Study. Then he was recruited to the Department of Epidemiology here. He's been here ever since. So as you'll hear, Bertie's work deals with multi-generation cohort studies of how child health is affected by maternal nutrition in pregnancy, or maybe I should say malnutrition in pregnancy. Bertie has done extensive pioneering research on three of the worst man-made famines of the 20th century. The Ukrainian famine of 1932-33, which is sometimes called Stalin's famine. The Chinese famine of 1959-61, that's associated with Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward. And the famine, which we will hear about today, the Dutch famine of 1944-45. So, over to Bertie Lumey.
Is this good? Am I setting my volume is okay? Very good. Jean, and thank you, and Steve, thank you very much for your invitation. It's a pleasure to talk to you. This is like a journey in memory lane for me a bit, because I'm putting is this better? Very good. I'm rearranging my lifetime activities but you shouldn't conclude from that I knew 40 years ago that I was going to talk about natural experiments, because the way it works, you start when you're 20, you follow not your path, because you don't know what your path is. You do what's interesting, and then you go from one stop to the next without even realizing it. So with hindsight, I think I'm talking, and my work is, if you can change me to my slides, I'm reflecting as to what I'm doing now based on my background. And I'm reflecting on natural experiments as a fruitful way to do epidemiologic research. As I will show you later, there's a long tradition of natural experiment research in epidemiology, but it was largely forgotten for a long time, and it's been revitalized recently with the Nobel Prize for Economists, as if they invited what I think is a very fruitful way of analysis. Very good. So as Steve indicated, I'm from Holland myself, and we didn't talk much about the famine when I grew up. The Dutch people had no interest in doing it. Dutch research had no interest in being involved with that. And it was only through work out of Columbia by Zina Stein, Mervyn Sasse, that people actually started to look at their own history. The Dutch famine involves a period at the end of the Second World War, when the Allied Army, Canadians, Americans had the Normandy landings and moved towards Berlin. And in that march, the Netherlands were left aside. So until the end of the Second World War, the western part of the Netherlands was still occupied by the German forces, and food supplies that were not readily available were cut off from the areas that traditionally provided these foodstuffs. Now, in the Netherlands is a very well organized country, or at least from reading the newspapers now, you wouldn't think so. But at the time, it was very well organized. I would say in terms of organizing things, the Dutch and the Germans have very much in common. What happens, and as a sign of this organization, the Dutch had prepared for food rationing well before the Second World War. In the 1930s, they had set up a system in the event of a war that would collect harvest from the farmers and put 70% of that in a kitty so that it could be reassigned in the event of a calamity. They were very smart in that they would allow the farmers to keep 30% of their produce to do whatever they wanted. So Holland had a system for redistributing foodstuffs, which was put into place really at the beginning of the war. And the diagram here represents the foodstuff that were distributed with weekly rations. And you can see that at the end of 1944, the available quantities were so small that the rations went down to 900 calories per person. This graph goes from 1940 to the end of the war. And on the right, you see a huge dip, and then you see a huge increase. The huge dip represents the drop in fertility following the lower rations and the famine. And the big peak represents the overshoot after liberation in the war. So we have population evidence in addition to the historical evidence. We have the population demographic evidence of the impact of the famine. So one example of foreign people, non-Dutch people being much more interested in the famine than the Dutch is this publication from the late 40s, I believe, by Clement Smith. Very famous. He was a military person who came with the American Army, and he documented the drop in birth rates in Rotterdam of the children born at the time of the famine. I don't have a pointer, but on the left is the normal birth rate, in the middle there's a drop in the birth rates, and then on the right is an increase in the birth rates. So as a young physician, he reported this in the Journal of Pediatrics. He later went on to become head of pediatrics, maybe in neonatology, even at Harvard Medical School. Very distinguished physician. No one can read this slide, but I'm showing this to you to illustrate how simple life was in the past in many ways. The letters written by Mervyn Sasser, a professor in the epidemiology department in 1968. He wanted to do a study, a follow-up study of people exposed to the famine, because he and his wife, Sina Stein, were very interested in mental development after early malnutrition. And there had been a lot of studies in Latin America that suggested that early nutrition was very important for mental development and for IQ. So Mervyn and Sina thought we need a setting where a normally well-nourished population experiences this very severe undernutrition hit, and where we can follow up the boys or the individuals who were exposed and examine their mental development at an older age. And they thought, and they realized that the Dutch military recruits who were universally examined in the 1960s would provide that opportunity, because we would have all the boys born in Holland. We could identify the boys born in the famine areas. We would have all the medical records at age 18. and then do the follow-up. So the story is that he wrote to Clement Smith and said, hey, you've been writing about the Rotterdam stuff. Can you put us in touch with some people that we can pursue our ideas? Short letter, March the 11th. In a week, he gets the letter back. Oh, sure. A lot of gracious exchanges, but the letter said, go to these people in the midwife school and they will be able to help you. So on the basis of that letter, Mervyn and Zena got in touch with the Ministry of Defense. It was called Ministry of War before, but now it's Ministry of Defense. And they arranged for the medical records, the medical examination records of these recruits to be available for study, anonymized, of course, but in essence, a lot of information about the recruits. This would no longer be possible, I think. And it's even that far that the records we've received, about 400,000, the Dutch government doesn't even know where it came from, and they can't give us copies. So what I have on a little stick, USB drive, that's what carries everything forwards. The records include, this is on the 18-year-olds, a lot of information that would be helpful. And Mervyn and Zena used that to look at some psychological attitudes and height and weight. And they published in Science that the famine at age 18 had no effect on IQ, although the scores of the sons of manual people were lower than the scores of the non-manual people. The coding is reversed. Now this generated some animosity because everyone knew that something bad would have to come out of the family, except the data didn't show anything. So there's a very big debate as to what was going on, and they got a lot of flack for publishing this. In addition, they published a paper in the New England Journal based on the height and the weight of these recruits, dividing the group by people exposed, born before the famine, after the famine, and in the middle. And they documented an increase in obesity for people, for soldiers, for recruits who were born in the famine period, in the famine areas. This and other stories were picked up, summarized in this book, which I discovered. This is my first time of discovering the Dutch famine story and realizing how come these people from the US do all this? How come we don't do it ourselves? I was very fortunate because I found this in a second-hand bookstore in England where they were studying, and I paid £1 for this. So based on this, I knocked on Zena's door and said, I'm from Holland, I'm interested in all this stuff. And by the way, couldn't you do this better and that better? And instead of kicking me out, she invited me in and arranged for me to study with her after I finished medical school. So we used their database to write up a follow-up study, selecting the recruits who were born in this area during the famine, before the famine, and after the famine. And with the Dutch follow-up records, we can look at vital status, we can look at cause of death. This, again, took very long to set up because I had to find the right general in the Ministry of Defense that would allow me to use the ID number for Mervyn and Zena to link to their records. But by luck, I guess we got this organized, and I'll tell you about the results in a moment. This slide is just to show that the drop in births for people conceived in the famine was not uniform. The richer people were less likely to, well, they were less likely to be affected by the famine than the poorer people. So there is a differential in fertility if you look at social class. This is the follow-up of the recruits. This was funded, I would say, about 10 years ago. Funded to, it was funded 10 years ago. So what we got in place is the link with the Vital Statistics Office. And we now have real-time follow-up of these people. So they're like 75 years old. And our first report run was 10 years ago. So this is now actively linked, everyone. There we go. I forget what year this was. It's maybe 15 years ago. So out of all the recruits, 400,000, we selected the recruits born in the famine areas with a pre and a post-birth control, and did the follow-up on the subset because the linkage would be extremely important. And our follow-up was fairly complete, I think. So this is it's like a testament to the administrative data that are still available. So a priori, we thought we need broad causes of death, cancer deaths, cardiovascular deaths, and other deaths, in part because there had been many reports from other groups that maybe early exposure to famine could lead to increases in diabetes, increases in cardiovascular deaths. So we decided to focus on these. And we didn't find much change in the follow-up to age 62, except for an increase in deaths from external causes. And that increase was linked to exposure to famine very early in gestation. These external causes are basically accidents and suicides. We can't really identify from vital statistics the circumstances, but there is some signal here that there is a specific outcome that is related to early famine gestation, early famine exposure. Now, so the recruit studies will give you a picture of what happened at the time of their birth, because we have the place and date of birth combined with the historical record. It will give you a snapshot at age 18, and it will give you a follow-up mortality for age 60 at the time, and now continued to the current date. But it doesn't give you any biological information. So I thought it would be useful to go to hospitals, collect birth records, and then write to the women who had delivered or the babies born at the time. Hi, how are you? You were born in our hospital in 1945. We'd like to know how things are going, and we'd like to interview you. Because we were interested in the biology. We wanted bloods, we wanted DNA, we wanted interviews to see if we could link the outcomes described after the prenatal famine to these intermediate mechanisms. This is the hospital where I trained and where we collected the data, the Wilhelmina Gasthuis. At the time, of course, the Germans didn't like the name to be Wilhelmina Gasthuis because that was the name of the queen. So at the time, it was known to be the Western Gasthuis, the same capital name, but not the same person name. So what I did, I went into the clinical records of this hospital, and this is how they look. So you have a name, a date of birth, you have the prenatal history, and you have various other annotations. So based on this, we set up a follow-up from birth until 2003, 2005, when we got the data. So we can relate our medical examinations of men and women aged 58 or so to their birth records. So this is reflected in the family study. I selected records from not just one, but from 3 hospitals, all in the famine cities, with controls group born before and after. Starting with the names at birth, we traced them to the population register, and we also asked to the women, please bring in your sister, if you have any, who was not affected by the famine, and to the boys, we asked them to bring in their brother. So we have a sibling control for all our outcomes with the same mother, certainly, mostly also with the same father. I'll try and summarize. These are the birth rates in the various hospitals in 1944-45. The background is the ration going low, 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 going high at the time of liberation. And the dark solid line shows that the drop in birth rates that Clement Smith talked about is neutralized, compensated, recovers within a few weeks at the end of after the end of the famine. Now, when I talk to you later, I will show you that the long-term impact of the famine on diabetes and various other outcomes is not related to these births that had the lower birth rate, but it is related to the births who were conceived at this time and born here with a normal birth rate. So we have a disjunction, and this means that birth rate is not always a good indicator to identify a critical period in gestation. This is just showing you the use of the siblings. On the right, all the bars are north of the solid line, and it means that for various outcomes, body mass index and glucose, the siblings who are exposed do significantly worse than their brothers and sisters who were not exposed. This is an example of what you can do with the biological materials that were collected. We collected the blood, and we focused on differences in methylation of a gene related to growth and development. This is an illustration of the food droppings in Holland that is widely published and also used to as an illustration of the various events. But this is the real story. So this is an example of photoshopping in 1945, because the event happened, but this plane didn't drop any of the foodstuff. And you can tell because the flaps that released the bombs are closed. So I always think, should I tell the museum that this is a doctored photo or not? This is, of course, an example of an American plane dropping food. That is true. What happened is that we show systematic differences in DNA methylation at that specific growth factor locus that distinguishes the famine-exposed girls and boys with their unexposed siblings. And this is the first really documented event or the documented instance where we have something that is in between the exposure and the outcome that we later much talk about. In the controls, we don't see anything. So these are the babies who were born with the lower birth weights, and there is no long-term effects. The previous slide are the babies who were exposed in early gestation and are therefore born after the war with normal birth weights. And those are the babies that do show the effect. So with hindsight, we've been using this natural experiment to try and find out what is going on, because the individuals were involuntarily exposed to these events. And the only thing we had to do is to take advantage of this and to deal with very specific issues that emerge from the political situation, because we may have nutrition rations available to us, but that would only be important if enough people were depending on the rations. If people had enough to eat from black market sources and didn't need the rations, then that information wouldn't be relevant. Many of you will know this is an epidemiology example of the use of a natural experiment, John Snow in London in the late 19th century, who used a cholera epidemic and divided the victims in people who had access to clean water and people who had access to not clean, contaminated water. And by doing that in London, he was able to identify the agent, not the agent, but the source of the epidemic. So that's an early example in epidemiology. He did this in London, and there was a very famous map where the housing and the people, the victims, they were all subdivided by the source of their water supply. The natural experiment was, yeah, as I said, we can skip that, skip that also, recognized by economists who take a very statistical approach to sorting out the possible sources of error that come when the experiment is not under your total control. But I think their work is not new, but very important in complementing what we do in epidemiology. We have a little time, I think, to illustrate this approach in two other famines, one in Ukraine and one in China. And I must say that this was all stimulated by the notion that we could potentially use these famine calamities to learn more about early programming, early gestation, if the circumstances were such that we have reliable information on the exposure, reliable information on the follow-up. And this is what we try to do in Ukraine. This is a map from the 1930s. And as you may know, in the 1930s, there was a huge famine in Ukraine, 1932, 1933. The Soviet Ukraine had to do with the suppression of the farmers in Ukraine because they were too independent in Stalin's view. And the famine was exacerbated because access to foodstuffs was stopped by the Soviet army. The natural experiment is that in current Ukraine, the borders have shifted very much. So current Ukraine includes regions that were part of Poland, part of Romania. And it also shows a very distinct gradient in the severity of the famine. So we use this information. It would be ideal then if we could follow up individuals who were born in these various regions and to see if their risk of diabetes, that is what we're then focusing on, if that would be different depending on when they were born, where they were born. So we had our outcomes from the Diabetes National Register in Ukraine between 2000 and 2008. And we have a population at risk, first defined by the people in the census and currently defined by the births in these regions over a long period of time. And our idea was to look at the odds of diabetes, comparing people born in a severe famine area to people born in a non-severe famine area. We took advantage of the fact that the famine in Ukraine was extremely well defined by political reasons in time. It was concentrated in a 6-month period in 1933. And we classified the oblast, the various provinces in Ukraine, by the severity of the famine at the time from various mortality estimates. In an earlier study, we only had available a limited number of provinces. And the current study I'm working on, what we have available is those in the entire country. We showed before that the pattern of diabetes, so this is diabetes established in 2000, 2008, shows a peak for births in early 1934, 9 months after the peak of the mortality. So that suggests that 60 years later, the people conceived at the height of the famine and born 9 months later show the highest diabetes peak. Is this clear? Maybe So there's a time factor here where by indirect ways, we also establish that the long-term impact of a famine is not the same for every fetus, for every baby. It depends on the time of the exposure to the famine. And it does not depend on the birth weight, because the birth weight is not a good indicator of famine exposure. So this is what we're currently working on. We have the reporting in the entire Ukraine, 20 provinces. We classify these provinces by the severity of famine in 1933. Extreme, severe, significant, no famine, color-coded. And we see that for people born in the extreme provinces, there's a peak of diabetes in 2008. That goes down again. And a dose response relating to the severity, I mean, 1, 2, 3, and controls. There are various other patterns in the data, but the clearest pattern is a peak in the births in the first half year of 1934. So this is a nationwide study. Before I finish with China, any questions in between? Clarification? Okay.
Do you think that the effect of females would, the Ukraine was both males and females?
Yes. So the Holland data of the recruits is men only. The data with the methylation is men and women, but a very small group because we had to interview people. And Ukraine is men and women. And the impact that we see is extremely similar in men and women. The last few slides is on diabetes. So my student Shiva, who is now at Michigan, and Chunyu also helped, is to examine if we can learn much in terms of long-term follow-up in China. There have been a lot of studies in China which mostly we think have problematic methods because in all outcomes you have to think, what am I comparing my exposed people with? And in the China studies, the comparison group that is mostly chosen are people who are born before the famine. No, sorry, people who are born after the famine, because there's a fear by the researchers that if you choose people born before the famine, they would have been exposed in their early youth, early infant years, and would therefore be contaminated. Now, a problem in the Chinese analysis is that people born before the famine are older than the famine. And for diabetes, it makes a difference if you're 55 or 60. So I'll show you in a minute that many of the facts that were assigned to famine, attributed to famine, are in fact related to not taking age into account, which is, Shiva and I did a meta-analysis, but it was shocking that all these studies, none of these studies recognized what was going on. So I'll get to that in a second, but I'll show you this. So these are the census counts, the birth cohort counts, and in the darkest provinces, the counts go down the most in the census, suggesting that the famine was the most severe. We don't think that the census data could be doctored, manipulated by political reasons, because you would have to have an overall impact that a certain category of people born in a certain year, in a certain region, would need correction, and this is not what's happening. The other merit, I think, of this picture is to show that if you do a famine study, you want to do this in an area that had very large famine exposure, and it was not uniform in China. This is the aggregate picture over the famine years, which you can tell from the severity in 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, that there's a gradient and a time element to this. We have not been able to do studies in China for obvious political reasons also, but for people to go ahead and do that, I think they should take into account that you want to go where the money is, right? You want to go to very severely exposed regions. This issue was work that I referred to, where we look at reported studies in China about overweight, obesity, diabetes, hyperglycemia, hypertension, metabolic syndrome, and schizophrenia. And all of these reported studies tend to, in the summary measures, tend to suggest that the famine births have more diabetes, which we think is because the control group is younger, and the famine burst tests, because they're older, would have more likelihood to develop diabetes. If you then try and correct this picture by adding controls to the left and to the right of the famine, then the whole picture neutralizes, except for the schizophrenia study that had a very good control before and after, and where the prevalence of before and after did not change. I think I'm nearly there. Let's see what's next. So in summary, do we know what's going on? We have epidemiologic correlations. We have a timing of exposure to fetus, early gestation, that is correlated with health outcomes. We have a possible mechanism in DNA methylation. And this is as far as we can go, I think, at the moment, as epidemiologists. So I hope that the further analysis of the biological materials would maybe further pinpoint the mechanism, because we have the timing of the developing fetus era. And we have now, of course, studies looking at metabolomics, where we can, from the protein breakdown, maybe identify changes related to specific organs in these individuals. So that may help us further define whether the changes in the organs from the DNA analysis relate to the changes in cause of death and mortality from the demographic analysis. But that'll be a challenge for the future. So fortunately, what we do see is that at least the timing and the affected populations seem to be extremely consistent. Let me leave it at that. I'm a little over. I apologize. And open it for questions.
Thank you very, very much for an extraordinary lifetime of meticulous and challenging work. It's really, I don't know how many of you have ever done this kind of work, but it's an extraordinary record. I have one little insight. When I was born in a displaced persons camp after World War II, and it was really interesting. My mother was a non-drinker, but the common folk wisdom was that they made her drink beer every day, and she was allocated a barrel of apples, and was forced to eat several fresh apples a day. And I'm wondering if some of this isn't folk wisdom that was gathered from people having some kind of notion of the effects of malnutrition. And the second thing that I'm thinking about is we have all of these programs for our public health programs, and we absolutely miss these early days in the impoverished populations. They all show up for prenatal care well into their pregnancies, and you know, how much of what we're seeing in that segment of the population is due to this kind of deprivation early on.
Thanks, Jean. Thank you for this illuminating talk. A general question for you. Given what you describe about the effects of prenatal development on the life of a person for their lifetime, have you any data suggesting the degree to which this impact of starvation prenatally goes to another generation? In other words, do you have an expectation that the current distribution, anytime, any place of diseases like diabetes might reflect ancestral previous generation starvation or difficult moments of the sort you described?
Yes, I love this question. I love this question, but many people want me to answer yes, but the answer is no. I'll tell you why. We did. You can. I'll tell you why. There's been many studies in the most famous scientific journals that attribute the diabetes epidemic in China to the famine 60 years ago. And this gets lapped up, no problem. If you write a story like that, it will be published tomorrow morning. So we have been discussing in debate with these guys because we say, consider the number of people who were exposed to the famine in Ukraine or in Holland or in China. If all of these exposed individuals had a twofold lifetime risk of diabetes, what proportion of diabetes today could be attributed to these people in the mix who had famine exposure? And in Ukraine, in Holland and China, it's about 1%. So that's a combination of the lifetime risk and the number of people exposed. So one problem in these studies is that I feel as if I'm always tempering expectations because it's hard to publish that you don't see an outcome, a difference. If everyone knows, there must be something. So in response to your question, we can't link this to current diabetes epidemics because the effect of the famine on the prevalence is extremely small in relation to other factors that bring about the diabetes epidemic that relate to current dietary habits and lifestyle habits.
I'm just curious, if you'll forgive a naive question. It's easy to imagine how diabetes might be caused by, problems of eating and sugar and all that sort of thing. But what about schizophrenia? To me, that sounds like a different kettle of fish, but are they now finding that there's gut bacteria involved or is there some common etiological mechanism going on here?
I don't know this. I don't know anything about the mechanism, but I know that the schizophrenia findings are extremely robust because it was established in Holland, it was established in China 2 times. So the robustness links schizophrenia prevalence with a specific timing of famine exposure. So that's something, that's a starting point for the discussion, but I don't know anything about the mechanism.
Very basic. But when we talk about, are we talking about if the birth rate goes down, is it because in a famine, people have no interest in sex? Is it partly because at the time of the famine, the mother or father are starving and therefore whatever the result will be lower? Or is it that over the course of the pregnancy and the time of birth, that then the impact on the child will be terrible or negative because the pregnancy has been negatively affected by not having enough food. So I'm not sure what the dates mean, because there are several dates that are lively here.
Obviously, there's a combination of things going on. We don't have the individual intakes. So these are aggregate findings where on average people had lower intake and lower fertility. But unrelated to this study, there are certainly studies that show that fertility goes down in mammals after lower calories. So there's an element, a biological element in fertility. Amenorrhea is something that is induced by famine, but can also be induced by other things, including what we see in extreme sports. Women athletes under certain training programs also have amenorrhea. So that's not related to famine, but related to other lifestyle conditions. So what you say is we have a combination of which famine is a very important component that we can identify better because of the timing.
In talking about the Chinese famine, you said it was reported that the incidence of diabetes was such that the people affected by the famine had a much earlier onset of diabetes. Is that true as well, or is there no data about the Dutch and the Ukraine famine?
I didn't mean to say that the age of onset was earlier. But that's an important question, and it could be true because in the Dutch data, where diabetes is increased after early gestation famine, we also see that the proportion of overweight boys when they were only 18 years old is higher in the same time period. So we're thinking, yes, they already maybe show the higher obesity that later translates into diabetes in the same. But the age of onset is something that we have not reliably documented.
Has there been any work on the famine, the Bengali famine or the Irish potato famine that might shed any light up?
According to my historian colleague, that would be good to explore, but the data available are much lacking because these are examples of famines that are extremely well documented. We have an exposure category, we have a population at risk, we have an outcome. But we could probably extrapolate and say likely these types of outcomes would also apply to the Bengali famine and the Irish famine.
Bertie, the potato famine, I mean, you wouldn't have good outcome data, even if you could get good birth weight, birth data. Would you?
No,
So you couldn't look at this question and because how a huge number of people died and then the other people left for the population went from 8 million to 4 million.
Yes.
Yeah.
so that's
Bangladesh.
in response I said we would
Yeah.
not have those
Yeah.
data.
But Bangladesh, you could, no? Hard to get good death data or good diabetes data. I mean, is that
It's
the crucial
possible.
reason you couldn't do it?
I wouldn't do it. I would ask someone who grew up in Bangladesh, who knows the setting, who has an interest in these questions, a local expert to say, why don't you set something up, talk to the right people, see what you can do, and then communicate with biostat people, epi people as to how you might set up this study.
Are there any questions online?
Excuse me. Given that there's a fair amount of public health interest in the persistence of malnutrition in the United States, I was curious to know whether there's any sort of notion of a dose-response relationship between what are clearly extreme lack of calories and the malnutrition, which I assume is not nearly as extreme, but nonetheless may have long-term consequences. So I guess my question is, do you think it's possible? How would you think about extrapolating information about famines back to our current sort of malnutrition problems?
I think that's difficult because the questions are not the same. What in doing these researches, I'm mostly driven by the question if we can identify a specific sensitive period, and if even the let's put it this way. My approach is not driven by trying to find the dose response curve and extrapolating, because I think we don't really have the data to do that. But I think it's important to do what the data allow, and that is to say, given the most extreme exposure, what is an outcome that we can reliably establish? How come, and then of all the things that have been attributed to the famine, I think only overweight and diabetes and schizophrenia emerge as solid outcomes. Because then we have a proof of principle and maybe a question for biologists that yes, for certain outcomes, you can have a lifelong effect that is mediated by changes in early gestation. Right. Unfortunately, but that's always the case, right?
Are there other questions? There's so much to think about because you have the possibility of genetic effects from methylation, but there's also calorie effect. I mean, there's just an enormous number of variables. I just wonder if some of your outcomes are on, because those are the things we choose to count, that we have data on, diabetes, schizophrenia. And
You were wondering what? I didn't
that
get
those are, that your outcomes are the things that society has chosen to count. And we really don't have good ways of knowing all the variety of outcomes that could result from this. Well, are there other questions? I'd like to really thank you on behalf of EPIC for sharing your extraordinary lifetime of accomplishments. And
my pleasure. Maybe I can finish by one thing. So my most important assignment at the moment is to make sure that the next generation will be able to access these data and know what's going on. And I'm presently condensing 40 years of notes and code books into something that is accessible. So I feel I should try and make sure, and things look good, that I have people with the same compassion who are willing to carry this forward.
thank you.